Marion Hughes Suge Knight Jr. spent a long time as one of the most powerful men in the entire music industry. As the notorious co-founder of Death Row Records, Suge quickly developed a reputation for intimidating pretty much anyone who stood in the way of him getting what he wanted. But one man he could never intimidate was 50 Cent. The G-Unit co-founder wanted absolutely nothing to do with Suge Knight and warned the rap mogul to stay away from him whenever their paths crossed. Suge Knight and 50 Cent's reputations. Years before Suge Knight crossed paths with 50 Cent and was on top of the music industry, he was a concert promoter and bodyguard for celebrities. Considering his massive frame and intimidating personality, that made a lot of sense. With the 90s on the horizon, Suge decided that he was done just being the muscle and launched his own music publishing company, which isn't remembered nearly as much as Death Row Records, but was notable for one reason. And that reason was Vanilla Ice's super popular track, Ice Ice Baby. In the grand scheme of things, Suge's encounter with Vanilla Ice doesn't really amount to much, but rumors surrounding unpaid royalties and a hotel balcony just showed the fear Suge instilled in people. While all of us associate the wildly popular song with Vanilla Ice, Mario Johnson was the man who allegedly wrote at least a portion of the lyrics and never got any credit. And when he wrote the song, he just happened to be signed to Suge's company, which meant that good old Sugar Bear wanted a big cut. One of the longest enduring rumors in the entire industry is that Suge reportedly pulled up to Vanilla Ice's hotel room with a bunch of goons, took him out to the balcony, and dangled him from it till he got what he wanted. It is a fun little story that really puts Suge over as a guy nobody wants to mess with, but it is not entirely true. In a documentary called Welcome to Death Row, the topic of conversation moved to that story, and Vanilla Ice himself was on hand to clear things up for everyone. In the documentary, he said, "He didn't hang me off from any balcony, okay? The story's been kind of blown out of proportion, and I want to clarify that Suge and I have no bad feelings towards each other." Regardless of what actually happened, Suge quickly pivoted and created an artist management company, which would actually form the foundation for Death Row Records. Suge would meet the Doc, through whom he would eventually meet Dr. Dre Suge. Doc and Dre would go on to become 3 of the 4 founders of the legendary record label in 1991. It was at this point that the legend of Suge really took off. After some growing pains, Death Row announced itself in a big way when Dre dropped The Chronic, a legendary album that didn't just take Dre to a new level and establish Snoop Dogg as a star to watch. He cemented his superstar status when he dropped Doggy Style the next year. The label made a bunch of money, but instead of making a concentrated effort to take Death Row into the stratosphere, Suge let his newfound power go to his head. The early and mid-90s were all about Suge beefing with anyone and everyone. He had become totally out of control with his violent, strong-arming tactics to get things done, rubbing Dre the wrong way. It was ultimately bad enough for Dre to leave the label in 1996 and start his own. Imagine how crazy Suge had to be for Dre to walk away from a company he co-founded and had a 50% ownership stake in. That wasn't all though. In the mid-90s, Suge took the East Coast versus West Coast rivalry to a whole new level. It was absolutely insane. Suge was always a dangerous guy, and he was even scarier when Death Row was at its peak. By the time he crossed paths with 50 Cent though, he was arguably more terrifying than he had ever been. Regardless, there was nothing he could throw 50's way that would faze him, and there was a really good reason for that. He had already been through much, much worse. 50 Cent was as hard as they came. He started dealing drugs when he was just 12 years old. In an interview, he revealed that he got into that life to make things easier for his grandmother, who had been raising him. He said, "I didn't want to ask her for a pair of Air Jordans when I knew she couldn't afford them, so I began working to get my stuff and not stress her out. The bottom line is, the obstacles that you overcome are going to determine how great you are." That sort of thinking would lead Curtis James Jackson to choose 50 Cent as his stage name. Back in the 1980s, Kelvin 50 Cent Martin would allegedly rob anyone for anything. That resonated with Jackson because he believes he is the same way. This mindset just proved that nothing would stand in the way of 50 Cent's road to success, not even getting shot a bunch of times and being left for dead. It is a story a lot of us know. Cent was shot 9 times. Back in 2000 at close range, he was hit in the hand, arm, hip, legs, chest, and face in front of his grandmother's house in South Jamaica, Queens. In an episode of Oprah's Next Chapter back in 2012, the rapper opened up on the fact that he remembered exactly what happened. He said, "I arrived around 12 o'clock in the afternoon on May 24th. She was bent over in the yard planting flowers, and I moved over here to get in the vehicle where my companion was waiting for me, and a car pulled up on the side of us, and a guy stepped out of the passenger seat of that car, came round behind it, and shot through the actual car. Miraculously, he managed to survive the shooting, and it gave him a new lease on life." In his autobiography, From Pieces to Weight, Once Upon a Time in Southside Queens, the rapper wrote, "After I got shot 9 times at close range and didn't die, I started to think that I must have a purpose in life. How much more damage could that shell have done? Give me an inch in this direction or that one, and I'm gone." The crazy thing is, all of this could have ended up much, much worse for the rapper. A little bit before he signed up with with Aftermath Entertainment, 50 Cent had been beefing with Ja Rule and his label Murder Inc. Records over a robbery Ja Rule potentially believed 50 Cent had orchestrated. The reason I mention this is because the IRS later revealed that there was potentially a link between Murder Inc. Records and Kenneth Supreme McGriff. Supreme allegedly ordered the hit on the rapper after 50 Cent insulted him in a song. He was no small-time player either. The Supreme team's drug network brought in about $200,000 on a daily basis. If that wasn't enough, Supreme had no problem taking out people as he deemed fit, as his crew was supposedly responsible for 8 murders in just 1987. The IRS affidavit read, "The investigation has uncovered a conspiracy involving McGriff and others to murder a rap artist who has released songs containing lyrics regarding McGriff's criminal activities. The rap artist was shot in 2000, survived, and thereafter refused to cooperate with law enforcement regarding the shooting. Messages transmitted over the Murder Inc. pager indicate that McGriff is involved in an ongoing plot to kill this rap artist, and that he communicates with Murder Inc. employees concerning the target. Luckily, no more potentially deadly violence came 50 Cent's way. Regardless, surviving that ordeal completely changed the rapper's view of life. That wasn't all though, because it shifted people's perception of 50 Cent as well. While he was earlier known for his mixtapes and unique voice, he was now almost inspiring to people because of his otherworldly toughness. After going through something so violent and traumatizing, someone like Suge Knight was probably no more than just another guy making a lot of noise to 50 Cent. Back in 2002, when 50 Cent signed with Dr. Dre's Aftermath Entertainment, he changed everything for the record label. And I'm not talking about just the music. Considering the way he rolled at the time, pretty much everyone at Aftermath had to take the necessary precautions. In an interview, D12's Bizarre talked about how things changed once 50 signed with the label in 2002. He said, "Definitely changed like how we was moving. We was in some we had to roll out the military, you know what I'm saying? Bulletproof vests, bulletproof cars. You know we didn't really have to worry about that before him." 50 Cent was a different breed altogether, the kind of man that Suge Knight had probably never seen before. Don't buy it? Here's another excerpt from his autobiography. "I don't necessarily view death as something negative. Death gives meaning to life. Living in fear of death is living in denial. Actually, it's not really living at all, because there is no life without death. It's two sides of the one. You can't pick up one side and say, I'm just going to use the head side. No, it doesn't work like that. You have to pick up both sides, because nothing is promised to anyone in this world besides death." Suge was trying to intimidate a man who did not fear death, someone who had survived the unthinkable and still managed to become a global superstar. Odds are that the rap mogul knew about 50 Cent's past, but may not have completely understood what it had done to his mentality. He was seeing red because of reasons I'm going to get into just now, and seeing as bullying and intimidation had always worked out for him, Suge assumed the same tricks would work on 50 Cent as well. But over the course of some volatile interactions, Suge would quickly discover that he would be better served staying away from the rapper. Why did Suge want to intimidate 50 Cent? There is a very real possibility that Suge's need to intimidate 50 Cent actually had very little to do with the rapper himself. To make sense of things, we're going to go back in time for a little bit. So you remember how I mentioned Dr. Dre walked away from Suge and Death Row back in 1996? Suge did not take that very well. A little while before Dre left Death Row, Suge had convinced Tupac to sign with the label. Once Dre was gone, Tupac turned on him, dissing him most notably in his track Toss It Up, in which he rapped, "No longer Dre Day, arrivederci blown and forgotten, rotten for plotting child's play, check your sexuality. As fruity as this Ali's quick to jump ship. Punk trick, what a dumb move cross death row. Now who you gonna run to? Laugh at you suckers, cause you similar pretending to be hard. Oh my god, check your temperature, screaming Compton. But you can't return, you ain't heard. Brothers pissed cause you switched and escaped to the burbs." They were Tupac's words, but Suge was speaking through him. Everyone knew that Tupac was loyal to a fault, so going after Dre wasn't exactly difficult for him. If it hadn't been for Suge paying over $1.4 million to post bail, Tupac would have still been sitting in prison. Anyway, that beef aside, Dre founded Aftermath once he was done with Death Row. He worked on a few projects for a couple of years before signing a fresh-faced Eminem at the recommendation of Jimmy Iovine, the head of Interscope Records. By the time we rolled into the 2000s, Aftermath had essentially taken over the role Death Row Records once used to play in the music industry, but without the shady financial dealings and strong-arming. After Tupac's death in 1996, the next big domino to fall was Snoop Dogg. The thing is, Dre and Dogg were able to walk away, mainly because of the fact that Suge was having a bunch of issues with law enforcement at the time. Back in 1995, he had been sentenced to 5 years probation for assaulting 2 rappers in 1992. But then he ended up going to prison for violating the conditions of his probation on September 7th, 1996. If that date rings a bell, it's because that was the night Tupac was shot before he died, 6 days later in the hospital on September 13th. After watching a boxing match in Vegas, Suge, Tupac, and their crew beat up a member of the Crips, which was what landed Suge in prison. prison. So let me take a second to set up a timeline. Suge pleaded no contest and was sentenced to probation in 1995. A few months later, Dr. Dre left death row, and a little while after that, Tupac was shot dead. To top it all off, he ended up violating his probation and went to prison in 1997. Tupac's death and Suge's subsequent incarceration ultimately spelled the beginning of the end for death row. Things got even worse when Snoop Dogg left the label and joined Master P's No Limit Records in early 1998. For the next few years, death row was surviving mainly on remixes and unreleased Tupac tracks, but the label, as everyone knew it, was dead. By the time Suge got out of prison in August 2001, the hip-hop landscape had changed almost entirely. Dr. Dre had discovered Eminem, who dropped the insanely successful LP The Real Slim Shady in early 1999. It was controversial and massively popular in equal measure, which used to be death row's sweet spot just a couple of years ago. Meanwhile, Snoop had decided to stop rapping about death and distanced himself from the thug life to an extent after moving to Master P's label. No elements of death row's initial success existed anymore. Nevertheless, Suge was hell-bent on getting back on top. In a statement, the rap mogul said, "I'm back, at my desk, in the studio, and on the street, which is where we're going to find the next generation of death row superstars. Death row is going back to where it belongs, at the top." Those were big words from the man at the helm of a struggling record label, and it did not lead to much. In the next few years, Suge was unable to find anyone who even came close to achieving the kind of success Dre, Snoop, and Tupac had. But worst of all was the fact that it didn't seem like Suge really had the ability to paralyze artists into fear anymore, ensuring that they did what he wanted. Dre, and more importantly, Snoop, was proof of that. Take a second to look at this from Suge's point of view. He had spent years as the man no one could say no to, but then when Dre walked away, it opened up the floodgates. This meant that anyone associated with the rapper at that point would automatically be at odds with the rap mogul. And soon after he got out of jail, he began hearing about this guy who had been shot 9 times, survived, signed with Dr. Dre's label, and was on the cusp of releasing perhaps one of the most anticipated albums since Snoop dropped Doggy Style about a decade earlier. If Suge had any hope of establishing himself as the top dog in the industry again, then he needed 50 Cent to fall in line. But the exact opposite would end up happening. Suge's downfall was already well underway, and the time he spent outside of prison between 2001 and 2003 was his last real shot at reclaiming his lost glory, and he could not have chosen a worse target to try and intimidate. Over the course of infamous encounters, 50 Cent would prove that Suge's time had passed, and that he wasn't nearly as scary as he thought he was anymore. The thing is, if Suge had just let Dre do his own thing, and focused on his own record label, then maybe his downfall would not have been as swift and shocking. But we have to remember that while he was a rap mogul, he was a bully and thug first, and there's always going to be someone tougher and scarier. That man was 50 Cent. 50 Cent gets Suge to back down. Get Rich or Die Trying was ridiculously successful. It sold more than 800,000 copies in its first week and was certified 9X multi-platinum by the Recording Industry Association of America, or the RIAA. While every track on the album was a banger, In Da Club was undoubtedly the standout. Even today, 20 years later, it remains one of the most recognizable and iconic hip-hop songs of all time. The track even made it onto Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest songs of all time. 50 Cent's first encounter with Suge Knight was when he was filming the music video for In Da Club. There was a lot that happened during that meeting. Firstly, Suge showed up to the set unannounced. The only reason 50 Cent and the crew knew he was coming was thanks to G-Unit artist Bang M Smurf. Smurf had been given a heads up when Suge was on his way to the set, and he was ready for pretty much anything to go down. In an interview, Smurf admitted that he was ready to kill Suge if he needed to. He said, "Because I already knew if I blew Suge head off, I'm playing like I'm scared for my life. Because remember, Suge had that image already, so I knew if I killed him, I would have done like 5 years. That's nothing. And I would have been playing like I was scared for my life. This Suge Knight." But luckily, things never came to that. Regardless, the meeting was super intense, and one wrong move could have led to disaster for everyone involved. Everyone was on high alert the second Smurf mentioned Suge's name to the crew. Eminem, in particular, was ready to step right up to the rap mogul and let him know that the guys at Aftermath were not intimidated by him. According to Smurf, Eminem strapped on a bulletproof vest and was ready for things to go down. He said, Eminem came back with the vest. Eminem was outside with them. Dre wasn't outside. 50 wasn't outside, but Eminem was outside. I guess they had to protect their breadwinner. Eminem put on his vest and ran back outside with us. Shout out to Eminem. D12's Bizarre jumped in and added, "It was like a standoff. I know it sounds like a made-up movie, but it's really true. We was shooting the In Da Club video and somebody said, 'Suge Knight here.' I was at the bar, gang was there, and they stopped and Suge came in with 30 Mexicans. I just remember, Smurf or 50 was like, 'What's up, man? What you want to do?' Suge looked at him and he took a puff of his cigar and he blew it out and he did like this and he left, just some LA type, intimidation type. Just take a second and imagine what the scene looked like. Suge pulled up with 30 Bloods, but instead of everyone bowing down in his presence, he was greeted by Eminem in a bulletproof vest stepping right up to him. If that wasn't enough, when he went on to meet 50 Cent, the rapper wasn't even mildly intimidated by his presence. Suge kept his cool, puffed his cigar, and bounced. But this was probably far from what he wanted. But overall, the entire encounter was telling, proving that the new guard had arrived and it was time for him to step aside. It had to have been a really bitter pill for him to swallow. But ultimately, the biggest blow to Suge was how this entire meeting ended. It wasn't just that he had failed to intimidate 50 Cent, but ultimately, he was run off the set by the rapper. Talk about being made to look like a fool. A few years ago, Russell Simmons talked about how 50 Cent responded to Suge's presence. I've already mentioned that he stepped up to Suge and wasn't bothered in the slightest, but that was not all. 50 Cent literally laughed at the entire situation, and when he saw that someone on Suge's crew was packing heat, he ran to his trailer and came back with an Uzi. Yep, that's right. Not only did 50 Cent laugh in the face of one of the most intimidating men in hip-hop history, he wasn't even a little fazed in the face of a gun. That wasn't even the worst of it. When 50 Cent returned with the Uzi, he actually chased Suge and his goons off the set with the rest of the crew. Even when you see 50 Cent talk about the whole exchange in interviews, he can't help but laugh. This entire situation would play a role in Suge's complete unraveling. He went to prison in 2003 for hitting a parking attendant, which was a violation of his parole. By the time 2006 rolled around, Death Row Records had filed for bankruptcy, and that was arguably the final nail in the coffin. Suge was still considered a dangerous man, but he was also a bit of a disgrace because he had driven Death Row Records into the ground. Without a massive record label under him, Suge was nothing more than a guy who liked bullying other people and spending a lot of time going in and out of prison. No one wanted to be associated with Suge anymore, and the industry moved ahead and evolved without him. While 50 Cent spent years building his legacy, Suge Knight took that same time to systematically tear his own down. Suge Knight and 50 Cent's legacies. I opened this video talking about the reputations both these men had leading up to them meeting one another, so it feels fitting to end it by taking a look at their legacies. Suge Knight will always be inseparable from the rise of hip-hop. Regardless of how he did it, Sugar Bear was instrumental in the creation and rise of Death Row Records. Without him, there would be no bailing out Tupac, which would mean fans would never get all eyes on me, at least not in the same way we did get it. The East Coast versus West Coast rivalry would probably not have been nearly as crazy as it was. Remember, it was back in August 1995 when Suge took to the stage at the Source Awards and openly dissed Diddy and Bad Boy Records. So when Suge said, "Any artist out there that wants to be an artist and stay a star and don't have to worry about the executive producer trying to be all in the videos, all on the record dancing, come to Death Row," all bets were off. Ask anyone and they will tell you this was a defining moment in the rivalry, taking it to a whole new level. Suge's involvement was a double-edged sword though. Sure, he was great at riling people up and getting his way, but the pros did not outweigh the cons in the long run. As Death Row grew, Suge failed to grow with it, and he never really became the businessman he could have been. When the business went away, the bullying mentality and violent tendencies were all that remained. Today, Suge Knight's defining moment has nothing to do with music or Death Row Records. Instead, it has everything to do with murder. Back in early 2015, Suge showed up on the set of Straight Outta Compton. Apparently, Suge was not happy with the way he was being portrayed in the film, and/or he wanted to be paid off for his likeness being used in the film. Suge was shooed off the set, and he got into an argument with two men in the nearby parking lot. Video footage from a burger stand that was near the parking lot saw Suge run over one man and drive into another, killing him. In 2018, the former co-founder was sentenced to 28 years in prison without the possibility of parole until October 2034. Ever since 2015, the only stories surrounding Suge have focused on his deteriorating health and, of course, allegations that Dr. Dre put out a hit on him. To his credit, Suge is trying to change the narrative surrounding him, striking a deal for a show that will focus on his life. When the show was first announced, he talked about why it was important to him, saying, "Over the last 30 years, there has been so much talk about Compton, me, the inner cities, and Death Row. A lot of talk. Even when it comes to making my movie, there has been so many imposters saying they have my rights, or they got the deal. That was and is all talk. I've jumped off the porch in my neighborhood at a young age, but never forgot where I came from. Most people try to ride for the hills. I made it and tried to bring as many people to the hills with me and feel that I was successful at it." The fact that Suge has turned to a relatively obscure streaming platform to tell his story in the hopes of changing the way people see him should tell you everything you need to know about where his legacy stands today, especially when compared to the man who played a pivotal role in sparking his downfall, 50 Cent. Having said that, 50 Cent's journey over the last 2 decades has been far from smooth. It can be argued that none of his other projects were as successful as Get Rich or Die Trying, and he had some financial troubles as well, filing for bankruptcy back in 2015, but he was able to bounce back. After spending years blowing his money on a massive entourage and a life of excess, he decided to get smart. He invested in vitamin water, which paid off really well. In general, music has taken a bit of a back seat for him as he has focused on his movie and TV ventures. Between acting as and serving as executive producer on Stars' Power and starring in the fourth film in the Expendables franchise, 50 Cent has a lot going on. But that doesn't mean he has left the music behind. People around the world were stoked to see him make a surprise appearance at the 2022 Super Bowl halftime show. Sure, he was hanging upside down, but it was still great to see him. He is even on the Final Lap tour, which started off in July 2023 and will run all the way till the end of the year, featuring a bunch of international dates as well. And that's the difference between both men's legacies. Forget about the money, the investments, forget about all of it. 20 years later, people around the world would still go crazy to see 50 Cent do his thing. Can the same be said for Suge Knight? When your entire reputation is built on fear and intimidation, you are going to be at the top only until someone bigger and badder steps up. For a long time, Suge Knight did his thing pretty much unchecked. It worked until it didn't, and it all came crashing down when he crossed paths with 50 Cent. I've already spoken about just why Cent was never going to be intimidated by a man like Suge. The rap mogul should have known better, but he failed to understand what set 50 Cent apart from the rest of the people who were more than willing to give Suge what he wanted to get rid of him. 50 Cent's warning to Suge Knight telling him to stay away was extremely effective, maybe even too effective, because like I said earlier, it saw Suge unravel completely. 50 Cent remains a one-of-a-kind artist, while Suge was one among many men who could only function through violence. The only difference was that Suge's tactics earned him a lot of power, at least for a little while, but a guy like 50 Cent was never going to buy into it, and Suge could not deal with it. And that's our video. If you liked what you just saw, check one of these out too. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.